Classification: Top Secret, the Sasquatch Evidence Archive, File 002B. They all tell different stories, different colors, different sounds, different angles, different distances, different vocabulary. But every credible sighting we've cataloged since 1978 shares a single, precise detail, an abrupt, localized interruption of human perception and technology that begins at the moment of contact and lasts anywhere from 30 seconds to 7 minutes. Cameras stop mid-frame, GPS timestamps jump, memory goes blank, radios hiss into white noise, watches leap forward, thermal logs smear into unreadable bands. This is not a power outage. This is not random equipment failure. Across decades and jurisdictions, across make and model, the same pattern repeats with the consistency of a watermark. The interruption is not a side effect. It is the phenomenon. We are declassifying the compiled evidence behind that single, invisible event. Today, this file opens a drawer you were told not to open. Inside, raw device logs, original witness statements under oath, chain of custody sheets, lab intake forms, and forensic outlines that map how the interruption behaves when it occurs and what it implies about the beings behind the sightings. Treat this as an evidentiary audit. Every claim must answer the question we always ask first: did the interruption occur? Listen to the language of the logs. A drone camera records a clear frame then, precisely at 17 hours 4 minutes and 34 seconds. Battery voltage plummets from 78% to 1% in 2.6 seconds. The image freezes on a blurred vertical. A field GPS shows a 3-minute timestamp discontinuity. An audio file ends with a low, inhuman exhalation and resumes 3 minutes later with a fractured syllable. A ranger's radio goes from clear transmission to a wash of static that persists for the duration of the gap. Sector-level recovery returns, no blocks where evidence should be. Devices from unrelated incidents, different brands, different operators, different decades exhibit the same signature. This archive is not built on hearsay. We've prioritized witnesses whose employments are subpoena-ready, whose field logs and routes are verifiable, whose reputations are otherwise unimpeachable. We prioritized devices with full chains of custody. We prioritized multi-sensor, captures audio, thermal geolocation, chemical sampling that converge, and then, at the moment of contact, diverge into the same strange nothingness. Why does this matter? Because the interruption severs continuity. It erases the very things that would make a sighting testable: uninterrupted data, coherent memory, cross-verified timestamps. Without that continuity, proof evaporates. Witnesses are left with a frozen frame, a smell, a bruise, a gap. The legal and scientific consequences brutal. An anomalous report that cannot be prosecuted, peer-reviewed, or even fully archived. Credibility becomes the currency. Careers and reputations live scam be spent to defend a narrative when the record has been cleaved. We do not offer easy answers in this file. We offer a pattern. We offer an instruction. Interrogate for the interruption first. Because if you walk away with one thing from file 002B, let it be this: the interruption is not an incidental afterthought. The interruption is not a side effect. It is the phenomenon. I hesitate in a way that's difficult to put in a redacted line to say what that implies. The evidence forces a question that makes professional detachment feel inadequate. If something on the landscape can time slice our records and fold memory into silence, then our methods of observing may be the very thing under attack. Keep that thought with you as you read. Keep it like a warning. The pattern is not random. When we plot every vetted interruption on a regional map, 3 corridors emerge like scars across the continent: the temperate rainforests and serrated ridgelines of the Pacific Northwest, the inland old-growth islands threaded through the northern Rockies, and a chain of low, complex foothills that bleeds into the Appalachian system. These are not casual backwoods. They are landscapes defined by tangled canopy, sharp relief, and a paucity of human transit logging spurs that die in wet clear-cuts, seasonal elk grounds that empty and refill like lungs, high-contrast river canyons where sound folds back on itself. The interruption lives where the land already conspires to hide. Climate here is an actor. Fog hangs like a screen. Thermal inversions trap low frequencies close to the ground. Nights drape long and deep through fall and spring. Inversions turn a distant thump into a nearby threat. Fog blunts visual cues and amplifies acoustic ambiguity. Wetlands hold humidity that bends electromagnetic propagation. In these conditions, a subtle field, whether natural or generated, can be magnified. Valleys become acoustic corridors that channel infrasound, basalt outcrops, and iron-rich soils bias local magnetic vectors. Peat and persistent bogs modulate ground conductivity. Put another way, the terrain concentrates anomalies into predictable pockets. The interruption across decades maps onto those geophysical fingerprints. This is where modern contact reports meet older stories. Indigenous oral histories from the Pacific Northwest and the Inland Plateau describe a large, shadowed figure that intervenes when hunters cross certain thresholds, not as folklore decoration, but as encoded land management, places to avoid, seasons to respect. Those histories are not footnotes. They are geotemporal markers that align with the archive's nodes. The modern dataset begins in the post-war era. Scattered sightings in the 1950s, then accelerates. Optics improve in the 1970s through the 1990s. With affordable digital devices in the 2000s, a new pattern appears, encounters that coincide with cameras, GPS units, and radios. The technology itself becomes the variable. Why geography matters is twofold. First, physical features create amplifiers and blind spots for both living systems and instruments. Low-frequency energy can propagate farther in a canyon than on an open slope. A wet canopy will attenuate high frequencies and leave only infrasonic signatures to reach a listener. Second, ecological rhythms concentrate movement. Late spring brings dispersals of juveniles and mating season roaming. Autumn is staging and fattening for winter. The archive's temporal analysis shows peaks in late spring and fall seasons when large animals shift ranges and when human activity patterns change. The interruption is not evenly distributed. It is seasonally biased and terrain sensitive. We mapped the nodes against human infrastructures, trails, staging areas, logging access roads, and found a strategic overlap. The interruptions cluster where two or more ecological corridors intersect, where human intrusion is intermittent but predictable. A hunting spur used twice a year, a backcountry trail that sees a surge of hikers for 2 weeks in October. That pattern suggests more than habitat preference. It suggests an operational logic, concealment where observers are likely to be and where the landscape will augment whatever process causes the interruption. Read it as a set of constraints. The land shapes the phenomenon exploits the land. Together they create pockets in which human perception and technology fail in the same way. This environmental signature is not incidental. It is the stagecraft on which the interruption performs, and understanding the stage is our first, non-negotiable step if we intend to observe without becoming the observed. Elise Mercer is the kind of witness the archive was designed to prioritize. 41 years old, 14-year veteran ranger with the U.S. Forest Service, advanced wilderness, first responder, clean personnel record, and a career built on procedural rigor. She kept route logs, signed radio check-ins, and carried agency-issued GPS and a small consumer drone for aerial transects. When she filed her report, she did it knowing the cost. "I knew what this would do to me at the station," she told the interviewer. "I knew how it would sit in a room full of skeptics." That admission, quiet, precise, almost professional, is the human stake in a raw, empirical nutshell. Reputation, livelihood, and the safety of others are on the line whenever a trained observer reports an anomalous event. On the day in question, Elise was alone, working a late-season survey across a known elk corridor. Her objective was mundane and defensible: document calving disruptions and flag hazards for subsequent crews. The environment favored ambiguity-dense canopy, low light, compressed valleys that the archive has already flagged as interruption-prone. She was methodical. GPS track on, drone at 120 feet, body mic live, scheduled radio check with base at 1/4 the hour. Her employer supplied subpoena-ready testimony and the permission to release redacted logs. That institutional backing transforms a story into evidence until the interruption arrives. Her account is clinical until it isn't. At 17:03, she reports a low, rolling exhale through the canopy and infrasonic pressure you feel more than hear, followed by a mechanical glitch in the drone feed. The image froze on a vertical blur. At roughly 17:04, the drone system time-stamped a collapsed battery percentage. The file shows a checksum error, and the frame resolves as a blurred silhouette. Her watch synced to GPS records an unexplained 3-minute jump. Her radio returns only static. Then, crucially, her subjective memory contains a lacuna. 3 minutes she could not recall. In her own words, and the cadence matters when you listen, there was this silence that was not silence. It pressed in. The hesitation is not theatrical. It is evidentiary. It is where the human stake turns into a personal wound. What she lost in that hole was more than footage. It was the continuity that underwrites witness credibility. Professional credibility, once fractured, is hard to restore. Elise faces the procedural consequences of reporting something that defies instrument continuity. Internal reviews, the risk of reassignment, whispers about stress or fabrication. There are operational consequences too. That night she replayed the missing minutes in her head until exhaustion. She missed a scheduled morning check-in because sleep fled her. A small community downstream hikers she was due to meet were briefly unaccounted for. Were her supervisors to treat her report as error, the liability would land on her. She could be blamed for missed alerts. The interruption, in other words, doesn't merely erase evidence, it puts living obligations at risk. The file preserves the human detail. Elise's posture, in interviews measured, meticulous, voice steady for most of the transcript, then a tremor returning when she describes the whole. She is simultaneously adamant and fragile. She filed a formal incident report and insisted on the chain of custody for her devices, requesting signature logs and immediate transfer to an evidence locker. That procedural insistence reads like someone protecting their credibility. It is also why the archive treats her account as high value. Trained observer, institutional chain, and willingness to accept personal cost to speak truth. Anomalous signs peppered the scene description. Elise smelled damp fur and a metallic ozone wash as the silence broke. Birds that had been chattering fell abruptly quiet. Later, within 24 hours, local game trails showed fresh, deep impressions, but those physical traces are summarized elsewhere in the archive. Here, the pressure is psychological and professional. Foremen who prefer tidy data sets, colleagues who demand repeatability, and a witness who must live with a 3-minute absence in her own memory. She returned to the trail the next week and found herself watching equipment as if it might betray her, again hesitant to trust the tools that once defined her competence. This is the human calculus, the interruption forces. A single event can cost a career, unsettle a community, and erode the chain of custody by destroying the evidence needed to defend a report. Elise knew this and filed a report anyway. That willingness, reputational risk for the sake of record anchors the case. It is not just about what was seen. It is about who paid to say it. The interruption takes more than data. It takes continuity, and with continuity, it takes trust. 1702, Elise records a GPS ping. The sky is thinning toward dusk. A late sun slants through fir and cedar. Birdsong threads the ridge. Her drone climbs to 120 feet to get an overview of the elk corridor. She is methodical. Checklist, waypoint confirmation, radio check. Everything in the logs is ordinary. The world is ordinary. The file preserves those ordinary seconds because they matter. 1703, a low, rolling thump moves through the canopy. Not a single footfall, but a measured rhythm, like someone tapping a tree at intervals impossible for a human gait. The drone's onboard mic registers an uptick and low-frequency energy. Elise notes the sound in her field notebook with a line, low thump, steady. Her voice is calm. She is trained to catalog anomalies, not to fear them. 1704, the drone camera resolves a vertical form across a distant ridge. In the feed it reads nothing like the animals cataloged in the region. Too tall, too vertical, an absence of obvious limbs in motion. Elise corrects the drone's yaw and zooms. The audio shows a rising harmonic between 12 and 18 hertz. The harmonic is subtle on a good day, not subtle here. The feed blurs as if the lens is looking through heat shimmer or thickened air. 17 hours, 4 minutes, and 34 seconds. System timestamp. Drone battery 78% gives 1% in 2.6 seconds. The image freezes on a blurred silhouette. There is a microhop in the video file, a checksum error later logged by the craft, a header overwritten by no blocks. Elise's handheld shows the same artifact, a 3-second stutter, then nothing. Her personal watch analog does what watches do. It jumps forward 3 minutes, 17 hours, 4 minutes, and 36 seconds, 17 hours, 7 minutes, and 12 seconds, absence. The radio returns only static. Her recorder clicks and then yields a flat line. On the audio, a transient spike punches the spectrogram at the exact frame where the visual freeze occurs. Then, silence. Not silence as in lack of sound, silence as a presence. Silence that has weight, silence that compresses the chest. She will later describe it the same way. There was this silence that was not silence. It pressed in. The phrases in the interview logs repeated, emphasized, then retracted like a hand from a hot surface. The transcript marks the moment as a lacuna, 3 minutes that do not exist in her recall. The devices mark it as corruption. The archives mark it as something else, an event. Use this moment in the scene as a physical void. Cut ambient sound. Hold the frame on the frozen video, a smear of dark against waning light. Let the silence fill the space between words. Let the audience feel the absence as an instrument. When sound returns, it does so in layers. First, a scent Elise says damp fur and a metallic ozone temps as if a storm were passing through wire. Then, the thud of a snapping branch, close and sudden, like a heartbeat offset by a half second. The drone resumes with a single, blurred frame and a battery icon that refuses to climb back. The radio leaks a single syllable of speech, indecipherable, that the analyst could not reconstruct from corrupted sectors, a human phoneme, or the artifact of an instrument. The file closes, reopens. Continuity has a ragged seam. The figure steps into a slant of late sun, not a creature running, a measured emergence. Height, covered in thick hair, musculature moving under the pelt with a slow, deliberate cadence. The face is angled away, the shoulders are wide. It tilts its head, not with animal curiosity but with an evaluation, a tilt that implies testing. Elise freezes. There is a beat, curiosity, then procedural observation. She moves to radio. Static. She moves to the camera. The feed stutters. Denial arrives as a practical reflex. Maybe a battery collapsed, maybe solar flares, maybe a manufacturing defect. Her training offers rational covers. They are insufficient. Panic is a later pulse. It arrives when she realizes communications have failed, and she cannot account for 3 minutes of her own experience, not just an equipment failure, a hole in continuity. The threat is not only the figure before her, but the loss of her capacity to document it. She knows the cost, missed alerts, questions of competence, liability for hikers downstream. The silence has not only erased sound, it has put consequences into her hands. As the being retreats, the silence returns, immediate and preternatural. Sound floods back in an uneven tide. The rustle of needles, a sudden chorus of birds as if resuming a paused song. Distant water. The drone's file is incomplete. The audio contains an exhale that is not human and a single weird syllable that the lab calls indecipherable. Elise's memory remains pocked. She remembers the approach and the retreat in shards, a vertical shape, a head tilt, the smell of ozone, but not the in-between. That in-between is the pivot. The silence brackets the sighting and becomes the sighting. In the minutes after, her hands are steady but her breathing is not. She documents everything with procedural rigor, GPS logs, timestamps, chain of custody requests. She signs each form. Her need to bind the event into paperwork is itself evidence. A trained observer trying to pin down a creature that is actively unpinning her records. The scene closes on a small, human detail. Elise rechecking the drone's batteries as if a battery could be trusted to tell the truth. This pivot, the silence that is not silence, is the event's signature. It is not merely a gap for later explanation. It is the point where the world we know is severed, where instruments die without chemical cause, where memory is salted out of the witness. The tape shows the figure. The logs show a discontinuity. The witness shows trembling conviction. The interruption does not only hide a body, it hides the continuity that would make a body undeniable. It is both shield and eraser. It is the hole in time that becomes the story. The evidence folder reads like a ledger of absence. What exists beside the hole that everyone agrees is real. Start with the footprints. 4 toe impressions pressed into damp loam. 17.5 inches per stride. Pad furrows that are neither human nor any known ungulate. The dermal ridges photographed at macro scale, cast in dental stone, show a repeating lattice unlike primate friction ridges. The casts were collected under strict chain of custody, signed, bagged, and logged. They sit in the archive with provenance that survives challenges to credibility. That physical trace anchors the encounter in something tactile. But the traces that matter most are the ones that record failure. Hairs snapped from a low branch went to a regional lab for cross-sectional analysis. Under polarized light, they displayed a familiar medullary structure, keratinous, mammalian, until isotopic assays arrived. The nitrogen signature was off. Elevated 1,4N/1,5N ratios outside the bin, expected for any wild diet in that watershed. Trace lithophilic elements, adherent particulates rich in manganese and cerium, clung to the cuticle even after solvent washes. Lipid extraction from the follicle revealed triglyceride markers inconsistent with known carnivore or herbivore metabolism in the region. The lab notes are clinical and cautious. Mammalian keratin with anomalous isotopic and trace metal adherence. Dietary proxies do not match extant local fauna. The conclusion is not sensational. It's a red flag that whatever left the hairs interacted with a different geochemical regime. Audio from Elise's body mic gives us the most unnerving signature. For 60 seconds, the recorder picks up normal forest noise. At 17 hours, 3 minutes and 12 seconds, a low harmonic builds to 12 to 18 hertz. A rising band you feel more than hear. The spectrogram shows energy migrating into infrasound bands. Then a transient non-harmonic spike at 17 hours, 4 minutes and 34 seconds, coincident with the drone's system time collapse. The resulting file, cataloged as emercer_1704.wav, contains an abrupt truncation. Waveform continuity halts mid. The file resumes exactly 186 seconds later with a single, garbled syllable that defies phonetic mapping. Sector-level disk recovery was performed by specialists using multiple platforms. The missing samples do not appear anywhere on the storage medium. The file header itself bears an irregular checksum pattern, repeated null blocks inserted where contiguous data should be a pattern, inconsistent with random bit rot or power loss corruption. The lab boxed their statement. Evidence of targeted overwrite or in-flight data, truncation. Electronic artifacts mirror the human lacuna. Elise's Mavic drone log shows a battery percentage drop from 78% to 1% in 2.6 seconds. Yet post-recovery battery cells show no chemical venting or thermal damage. The flight data contains checksum errors, incomplete frames, and file headers overwritten by repeated nulls. A corruption signature, the forensic engineer called structured overwrite. GPS pings triangulated from Elise's watch and drone reveal a 3-minute time-stamp discontinuity, accompanied by an apparent 80 to 120 meter drift, not a smooth drift, but a positional jump bracketed by normal fixes. Magnetometer readings on multiple devices deviate abruptly during the interval. Compass needles flick 2290 degrees east, then snap back. Thermal imagery did not capture a discrete hot body. Instead, the thermal video records an elongated heat smear with a trailing cool wake, an energy gradient consistent with a moving, distributed field rather than a point source organism. What makes these anomalies significant is their repetition across platforms and disciplines. Lithium cells from one recovered drone showed a rapid voltage collapse without the electrochemical evidence of short circuit or chemical breakdown. Multiple camera systems record repeated file header overwrites and sustained write errors. Audio logs from unrelated cases carry the same low-frequency prelude and the same truncated resumes. Forensics teams attempted every standard and non-standard recovery technique, parity checks, sector reallocation, bit-level reconstruction, naive interpolation of missing frames, and failed to reconstruct the missing intervals. The missing data behaves less like damage and more like deletion. Two things emerge from the lab bench. First, the interruption is physical. It leaves footprints, hairs, lipid residues, and thermal gradients. Second, the interruption is functional. It systematically compromises human sensory continuity and solid-state storage in a patterned way. Low-frequency energy, magnetoelectronic perturbation, and targeted file corruption. These are not mere coincidences. The pattern repeats with clock-like regularity. Prelude, spike, gap, resume. The file names, the chain of custody logs, the lab worksheets, they converge on the same word. The interruption is not an incidental byproduct of a nervous witness. It is a measurable event that interacts with both flesh and machine. We are left with an uncomfortable forensic framing. Something in the field is capable of producing a dual signature, neurocognitive blanking in human witnesses, and patterned failure modes in electronics, and it does so without leaving conventional weapons or tools. The corrupted audio file, the smeared thermal image, the hair with wrong isotopes, They are evidence of an event whose primary work is to erase, to interrupt, to make continuity impossible. We must ask the file's question and answer it with the only honest response the data allows. Did the interruption occur? The archived measurements say yes. The interruption is not a side effect. It is the phenomenon. Cross-case analysis turns a scatter of anomalies into a pattern that cannot be explained away by equipment quirks or confused witnesses. We pulled 5 dossier IDs across 4 decades: 1979 ORC, 1993, 2 CAS, 2006 OLI, 2011 BCH, 2018 ROK, and ran the sequence through the same forensic lens. The result is uncanny. The interruption repeats with a clock-like choreography, a low-frequency prelude, a sudden electronic spike, a discrete gap of missing time, then a staggered resume with corrupted records and altered witness memory. The interruption is the repeating measure. The interruption is the motif. 1979, ORC, commercial logbooks from a small logging outfit in northwestern Oregon record a single night where every headlamp dimmed for exactly 92 seconds. 2 men reported hearing an earth hollow exhale and then nothing. Not even the sound of raindrops. When their flashlights returned, a fresh set of 4-toed impressions led away from a nearby skid road and stopped at the edge of a clear cut. Chain of custody notes include a compass deviation of 37 degrees recorded on 3 devices, and a camera whose film frame collapsed. Mid-latrine exposure? The logkeeper's handwriting shows what the archive now marks as a classic response. Measured description, followed by an inked margin that reads, "Can't explain the missing minutes." 1993, CAS hunters on a ridge in the Cascades recorded simultaneous radio static lasting 3 minutes and 12 seconds. After the static, they found an elk carcass overturned and arranged several yards away from the trail. Its orientation changed as if repositioned. One hunter later reported episodic dreams that replayed the moment of silence in identical cadence. Biological samples collected near the carcass later produced elevated lithophilic metal traces on fur and bone surfaces, the same anomalous signature we observed in Elise Mercer's hair fragments. The interruption here coincided with a behavioral artifact, relocation, and representation of a kiln, suggesting purposeful interaction rather than accidental pass-through. 2006 OLI, a group of campers on the Olympic Peninsula captured a sequence of audio files that begin with a humming prelude at 15 Hz, spike into a broadband transient, then drop out for 87 seconds. File headers that followed were overwritten by null blocks. Every recovery attempt returned the same result. The missing interval behaved like an erased cassette, not like a degraded one. The campers all reported, independently, a shared dream pattern that night. A recurrence we have seen in a small subset of cases where human cognition seems to stitch gaps with the same synthetic imagery. Post-event field notes showed tree scarification within 48 hours and a peculiar stacking of river stones upstream, a not random signature repeated elsewhere. 2011 BCH, in British Columbia, a university biologist conducting avian surveys experienced temporary aphasia after a 2-minute electronic blackout. Her recorder's GPS jumped forward 125 meters during the gap. She lost only the verbal thread of 3 minutes. She retained procedural tasks. Her clinical follow-up was unremarkable except for a transient, localized amnestic episode. The biologist's report is meticulous and sober. Her employer's chain of custody files are intact, yet the crucial audio file, like Elise's, is corrupted at a binary level. File headers mangled, waveform segments missing. Forensics billed it not as damage, but as deletion. 2018 rock hikers in the Appalachians experienced a compass needle swing of 62 degrees, a camera that froze mid-step, and a conspicuous absence of wildlife vocalization across a 4-minute window. That region, long considered low probability for such encounters, aligns with an ecological corridor intersection on the archive map. The patterns push beyond geography into strategy. The interruptions cluster where 2 or more migration or topographical corridors cross, choke points where observers are most likely to detect movement. The interruption appears where it is most useful. Across cases, the technical signature recurs. Rapid voltage collapse without electrochemical residue. Repeated file header overwrites. Sustained write errors. Transient compass deviations. Thermal smears instead of discrete bodies. And low-frequency harmonics in the 12 to 18 Hz band preceding each event. The human signature also repeats. Missing time windows centered around 2 clusters. a short window clustered near approximately 90 seconds, and a longer one near approximately 180 to 220 seconds. Post-event markers repeat, metallic ozone smell, localized animal avoidance, and ritualized marking of substrate within 24 to 72 hours. The interruption is correlated with both place and behavior. The interruption is correlated with intent. Two interpretive frames survive the evidence. One is environmental, specific terrain, lithologic composition, and microclimate amplified natural infrasound and electrostatic anomalies. Animals or geological processes exploit these pockets, producing coincident disruptions. The other is behavioral. A sentient population has learned to exploit an environmental mechanism, or possesses a physiological capacity, to generate the same dual signature neurocognitive blanking in humans and patterned failure modes in electronics as an adaptive concealment. The data do not decide between these cleanly, but the archive does insist on a critical observation. The interruptions are neither random nor purely incidental. Their timing, repetition, and alignment across decades point to a functional pattern, a tactic, or a reliably exploitable niche. That conclusion carries consequences. If the interruption is merely an environmental quirk, it is still a hazard to documentation and to human safety. If the interruption is a learned or physiological capacity deployed by a large-bodied hominoid, then we face an organism that not only eludes us, but actively shapes how it is perceived. Either way, we must account for agency, either agency in the environment or agency in the beings who use it. The difference matters. The interruption is not a side effect. The interruption is the phenomenon. As the map fills and the nodes align into corridors and staging areas, the archive's central question hardens. Are we tracking a migration, a tactic, or both? The pattern pushes us from anecdote into system, and systems answer in patterns, predictable, repeatable, and dangerous if ignored. We arrive at a single, uncomfortable synthesis. The interruption is not incidental. The interruption is not a glitch in our instruments alone. The interruption is a tool across decades and corridors. The pattern converges on one plausible explanation. What we have cataloged is an adaptive concealment and cognitive disruption mechanism, deliberately employed by a large-bodied hominoid population or by environmental processes that those beings have learned to exploit. The archive's working hypothesis is technical and stark in equal measure. Coordinated low-frequency infrasound paired with a localized electromagnetic transient produces a dual damage signature. To human neurophysiology, the effect manifests as a brief erasure tension, shudders, memory gaps, a perceptual void. To solid-state systems, it appears as synchronized write errors, checks on corruption, power depression, and mislocalized GPS fixes. Two vectors, one endgame, deny reliable observation. Mechanistically, there are three avenues the evidence will not let us ignore. 1. A physiological organ and evolved resonator, capable of generating concentrated infrasound coupled to an electrostatic discharge, could produce the observed frequencies and field strengths at a distance. 2. Behavioral technology constructed devices or environmental modifications could be placed strategically in landscape pockets to focus acoustic and electromagnetic energy. An environmental amplifier specific topography and lithology that concentrates natural infrasound and electrostatic anomalies could be co-opted by a sentient species to mask movements and erase witnesses. These are not mutually exclusive. The most parsimonious model is hybrid, anatomy plus, environment plus, learned technique. The result is a curtain that falls for 30 seconds or 3 minutes, unpredictably tight, surgically placed between observer and observed. If you accept the hypothesis, the implications are immediate and unnerving. First, the interruption is functional. It behaves like a defensive layer and operational buffer that triggers when identification risk exceeds tolerance. Second, it appears to be discriminating. Not every hunter, hiker, or drone triggers the same response. Devices and behaviors that historically produced successful documentation tend to be the ones neutralized. Third, the interruption shows signs of learning. Repetition across nodes, the alignment of staging areas, and increased marking after events are not the hallmarks of random geology. They are the hallmarks of strategy. Here is the third layer, the part that makes even the most seasoned analyst in this file hesitate. The evidence suggests intentionality beyond passive concealment. Consider the possibilities side by side, and the room for moral panic becomes audible. Possibility A. These creatures recognize humans as observational threats and deliberately neutralize evidence tactics to sever chains of custody, to prevent cumulative identification. Possibility B, they selectively target instruments and individuals that through past encounters have proven most likely to produce persistent records and escalating deterrence calibrated to human investigative patterns. Both scenarios imply cognition, both imply foresight, both force an ethical and tactical rethink. If the observed can actively shape what we are allowed to see, then our very act of observation becomes part of the system we are trying to measure, admitting that it's an awkward, professional danger. We are trained to look for bias, to assume error before design. To entertain the notion of deliberate perception management is to risk being labeled credulous, alarmist, or worse, a target. For field scientists and rangers like Elise Mercer, the cost is tangible: career credibility, licensure, funding. For investigators, the cost is existential. If the phenomenon can erase continuity, then our standards for proof: photographs, timestamps, metadata, exactly what it attacks. We must confront the possibility that the interruption does more than hide an animal. It erodes the institutions we rely on to document and respond. There is another, darker consequence we cannot ignore. An adaptive mechanism implies evolution. Biological or cultural land, evolution implies potential escalation. If countermeasures to human observation are effective, selection pressure will favor those individuals or groups that refine them. Each successful erasure reduces the probability of durable exposure. Each failed attempt, each camera or team that persists becomes a lesson. We may be witnessing an arms race in stasis. Human technology advances, the phenomenon adapts. The longer we insist on conventional field methods without accounting for an agent capable of manipulating perception, the greater the risk that our presence will drive more aggressive behaviors, defensive, prophylactic, or retaliatory. This is the investigator's secret fear, the whispered caveat in footnoted memos. By documenting and publicizing these tactics, we might teach them, we might, unwittingly, reveal the weaknesses in our surveillance that they can exploit or the thresholds that provoke defensive deployment. I hesitate to release that thought into print because it sounds like superstition. Yet the pattern insists on it. The interruption is not merely a symptom to be recorded. It is a variable we alter by measuring. So the hypothesis stands, provisional and heavy with consequence. A sentient capacity, physiological, technological, or environmental, produces a coordinated infrasound, event, to erase continuity. To protect a population that has learned the value of remaining unidentified, the interruption is not a side effect. The interruption is the phenomenon. We proceed with the hypothesis not because it is comfortable, but because it best explains why we keep finding the same scar across decades, devices, and witnesses. We proceed because to do otherwise is to ignore a method, and methods, left unchallenged, become threats. We close this file with what the archive has argued from the first page to the last. Every vetted sighting carries the same scar, an abrupt, localized interruption that severs time, memory, and machine. The pattern is too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence. It is not random failure. It is not a battery dying at the worst possible moment. The interruption returns again and again with the same anatomy, a low-frequency prelude, a rapid corruption of digital media, a measured window of missing time, and witnesses who emerge with lacunae where continuity should be. Repeat it in your head. The interruption is not a side effect. The interruption is the phenomenon. That conclusion forces decisions. If the interruption is adaptive, physiological, technological, or ecological, then conventional fieldwork is insufficient. We cannot keep pointing cameras and calling it objective. We must build a methodology that treats the interruption as an active variable, not passive noise. The next phase of investigation must be rigorous, redundant, and ethically supervised. Practical steps, here and now. Deploy synchronized multi-sensor arrays at predicted nodes, not single cameras, but coordinated grids of heterogeneous instruments, low-frequency hydrophones and infrasound arrays, magnetometers and broadband M receivers, geophones and seismometers, thermal imagers with long integration times, and analog audio chains immune to software. Each array must timestamp to an independent, hardened clock and write to redundant write-once media that are air-gapped and stored off-site immediately after capture. Chain of custody is not optional. Chain of custody is evidence. Chain of custody prevents the very erasure this phenomenon seems designed to create. Hardened device architecture. Use isolated power supplies, physical kill switches, Faraday-shielded enclosures for critical recorders, and duplicate logging streams, one digital, one analog, so that systematic overwriting cannot simultaneously erase all records. For drones and mobile platforms, implement inertial recording that bypasses the onboard OS and writes to tamper-evident media. Standardized protocols for witnesses and teams, immediate debriefing, medical and cognitive safety checks, rapid biological sampling of any physical traces, and legal protections for those who report. Witness credibility is a human stake. Treat it with the same forensic rigor as a corrupted file. Institute ethical controls and indigenous partnership. The landscapes where this occurs are not empty. They are ancestral territories with their own knowledges and obligations. Collaborate with local communities and honor guidance about where and when to place equipment. Do not convert surveillance into trespass. Scientific replication must be accountable. Limit methodological disclosure. There is an uncomfortable truth. By documenting how we observe, we may teach the thing we seek to document. Publish protocols in curated peer-reviewed form, not as a public blueprint for replication. Release evidence, but keep tactical details that would allow exploitation of our observation thresholds strictly controlled. This is not secrecy for secrecy's sake. It is containment of risk. To the public, the archive will declassify Elise Mercer's redacted GPS logs and the corrupted audio sectors from E-Mercer_1704.WAV in the next upload for forensic review. We will also publish a baseline geospatial map of predicted nodes and the metadata schema we used for cross-case correlation. We are releasing data for scrutiny because reproducibility is our defense against both denial and manipulation. But we do so cautiously. If you have field data that matches the interruption signature, a sudden device corruption coincident with missing time, low-frequency recordings, anomalous thermal smears, or unexplained foretold impressions uploaded anonymously to our secure portal, preserve the original media, preserve the chain of custody. Do not open corrupted sectors before submitting. Imaging tools require untouched sectors for the best chance of recovery. We will accept submissions, triage them, and if warranted, coordinate targeted, supervised replication at lower risk. This is a call, not a dare. We are not asking for sensationalism. We are asking for disciplined evidence. Preserve the tape, preserve the log, preserve the witness. If you value this work, subscribe to the archive for the next declassified file. File 003, the infrasound pattern that erases witnesses. Help us fund hardened arrays, field teams, and indigenous-led oversight. Share the file, but keep the methods confined to those with a demonstrable need to know. Listen for a moment to the silence. Hold it. The silence is not empty. It is a clue. The interruption is the phenomenon. Map it, measure it, protect those who step into it. And, above all, remember why we began this work, not to prove monsters, but to protect truth, continuity, and the people whose credibility the void has already cost. Like, subscribe, and return for the next file. The archive is open. The silence is no longer unknowable.